Okay, FBI Director Kash Patel did another interview this time with independent journalist Catherine Herridge, who is a fantastic journalist. She is one of the good ones. And she asked Kash Patel about the Epstein investigation in the wake, of course, we'll just go back to July here. We're not going to go all the way back to February. But in July, of course, there was a leaked memo from the Department of Justice, from Kash Patel's boss, Pam Bondi, leaked to Axios, in which the Department of Justice said, okay, guys, we told you were going to get all the Epstein files, but you're not. Now you're not going to. And please ask no more questions about any of Epstein's associates. We don't see any evidence of any foul play, any evidence that he blackmailed anybody. And even though we have, 50,000 documents, you're never going to see a single one of them. Goodbye. That was in July, of course. Fast forward to August, some members of the House of Representatives sent a subpoena to the Epstein estate. That is, of course, the belongings, the possessions of the now deceased Jeffrey Epstein. The House of Representatives sent that subpoena to the Epstein estate, and the Epstein estate did comply with at least part of that subpoena. I don't know the full breadth of the subpoena, but we know that the Epstein estate has given the House of Representatives emails from Jeffrey Epstein's inbox to Jeffrey Epstein and from Jeffrey Epstein. We talked about those on the show last week. We talked about the Democrats, of course, in the House of Representatives tried to selectively cherry pick 1 or 2 or 3 emails, which they portrayed out of context in order to try to get you to think that Trump had done something wrong, because they're so obsessed with the idea that Trump is associated with Epstein's crimes, even though he's not. He's not. There's no evidence that he is. In fact, there's evidence that of the opposite, that Trump was the one that turned Epstein in, and Trump was one of the only ones cooperating with law enforcement. So after the Democrats staged that little propaganda effort, the House Republicans released the entire batch of emails, Epstein emails, that the Epstein estate had given them. And my first reaction to this, of course, and I told you this last week, was, wait a second, where are these Epstein emails even coming from? How come the Department of Justice told us there were no other relevant emails when clearly these are relevant to the investigation and to knowing who Epstein talked to and about what? And the Department of Justice apparently had not issued any similar subpoenas to the Epstein estate. Well, in the wake of the new revelations that were in these Epstein emails, that the Democrats, specifically elected Democrats like Hakeem Jeffries, for example, asked Epstein for a donation after Epstein had been convicted of abusing underage girls, a connection you wouldn't think the Democrats would really want out in the open, right? Well, Kash Patel was asked by Catherine Herridge about this ongoing investigation, and his answer was very different than the last answer that we heard from the FBI and the Department of Justice about the ongoing investigation. We were told it was closed, but now apparently, who's to say? This is Kash Patel.
On the Epstein files, the Epstein Files Transparency Act has a very tight deadline, 30 days to produce unclassified records. Will the FBI meet the 30-day deadline?
Well, we are working with our partners at the Department of Justice to produce, as we've always committed to producing, what we can lawfully, legally produce. And we will continue to meet those metrics, reminding the public that there are court orders in place, protective orders, and orders to seal in place that legally prohibit the disclosure of information related to any investigation when there's a court order of that fashion. So we're working with DOJ to say if we can produce anything more.
As FBI director, will you commit to as few blacked out sections or redactions as possible?
We always do. We have in our productions to Congress, which have been historic to this year, and we'll treat every matter in the same fashion while also upholding always victims' rights. Victims' rights in any case, whether it's President Trump's case, this case, or any case, the victims' rights statutes are preeminent, and we will protect those victims at all costs.
President Trump told your boss, Attorney General Pam Bondi, to look into the relationship between Jeffrey Epstein and Democrats, including former President Bill Clinton. Is the probe limited to Democrats, or will you follow the facts wherever they lead?
We'll just follow the facts. It's pretty simple for this FBI.
This administration campaigned on releasing the Epstein files. What do you say to Americans who are skeptical that there will be actual justice under a Trump administration?
Look at the work of this FBI. To date, in the 9 months that I've been on this job, we've arrested 30,000 people. 25,000 of which have been violent felons. That is double increase from year to date from the same time period last year. We have taken on our priorities in counter-espionage work to an increase of 35% more arrests year to date alone. On the drug front, we've seized 1,900 kilograms of fentanyl. That is a 35% increase from year to date last year. That's just the work of this FBI. We found 5,400 and identified 5,400 children, missing children. That is a 17% increase from this time, same time period last year. These are just a few examples of how committed we are to working the criminal cases for the American people so everyone gets treated the same.
So more charges are possible in the Epstein case.
Based on the new referral, we'll take a look at that and see what evidence comes. But there's an important distinction. The information that the government possesses versus the information that the Epstein estate possesses. Those are two separate boxes of information. And the Epstein estate has not been willing to share information with the U.S. government. And so even though we've requested them to do so.
I wonder what that means, though. When he said the Epstein estate has not been willing to share their information with the government, even though we've requested that they do so. Well, did you just ask? Did you just send a text message or a letter or pick up the phone and just say, hey, would you show me all the dirt on Jeffrey Epstein that you own? Or did they send a subpoena? Did they send an investigative subpoena that the Epstein estate has a legal obligation to comply with? I would love to know the answer to that question. Listen, I think Kash Patel has done a good job in his crime stopping, as a crime stopper, in his crime stopping capacity. The FBI actually has essentially two functions. They serve as crime stoppers, and then they serve as an investigative body. And as a crime stopper, I think it's fair to say that Kash Patel, I mean, you heard some of the statistics that he rattled off there. That is impressive, and I do appreciate that he's focused on bringing those people to justice, catching them, stopping them from committing crimes. But I think it's a very different function of the FBI to go back and unravel plots or crimes, these complicated criminal endeavors that have already been carried out. I haven't seen from the Kash Patel FBI a satisfactory record on that. I'm talking about January 6th. I'm talking about the pipe bomber. I'm talking about investigating, Fauci and his ilk over the funding of the Wuhan Institute of Virology and lying to Congress. I'm talking about, of course, the Epstein stuff, when you want the Whitmer Fednapping, all of these different, you could call them deep state plots against the American people. Even FBI agents themselves who targeted journalists from Project Veritas or Catholics because they're Catholic, or parents because they didn't want their children indoctrinated with critical race theory and trans ideology in public school. I haven't pro-lifers for praying outside of abortion clinics. I mean, you name it, you're probably on that list, or at least a characteristic that you embody as a Christian, as a conservative. You probably share with people who were targeted because of that characteristic that you share. I haven't seen from the Kash Patel FBI the same capability or excellence that Kash is claiming when it comes to his crime-stopping ability in his investigative ability. And that's the part that I wish we would see more of from the FBI, and I wish that we would see a better record from the FBI, because, like I said, the theme of this entire Epstein debacle that started back in February, it's lasted almost through the remainder of this year, which is wild, has just been contradicting narratives left and right. Every person that opens their mouth is contradicting the person before them, whether it's Pam Bondi contradicting herself, whether it's that memo contradicting, well, I guess that's contradicting Pam Bondi again. Kash Patel and Dan Bongino talking about how there's, definitive evidence that Jeffrey Epstein killed himself and there was no foul play. And then us being told we weren't going to see anything else. And there weren't other people associated with Jeffrey Epstein who, that there was evidence that they committed crimes to the point that the FBI would investigate it. But now there is a referral that shows evidence of that. It's just this constant, it's chaotic. This constant chaos from the Department of Justice and FBI when it comes to the Epstein investigation. And what I want to do now is I want to read you a thread from a journalist. She's a journalist at the Miami Herald, and she is actually the journalist, one of the journalists who was at the forefront of the investigation that led to the initial arrest of Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell. She's kind of an expert on Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell, and she wrote a thread that I thought was fascinating, and I think you will too. She said, there's a lot of confusion on what constitutes the Epstein files, which is exactly what I was talking about last week, right? The FBI or the Department of Justice said there are no more Epstein files, and then here the Epstein estate gives Congress more, and then Congress passes this law that forces the Department of Justice to give files that they said didn't exist. And I'm just like, what are we talking about? Where are these files? Who has them? Well, Julie Brown says, so let me explain. First, there are the DOJ FBI federal criminal case files. This is what Congress voted to release this past week. A small subset included with the DOJ files are the federal grand jury files. This is the evidence federal prosecutors present to a grand jury in order to get an indictment. It's a very small percentage of the files. The Oversight Committee Epstein files, Julie Brown writes, these are the files that Congress obtained from the Epstein estate by issuing a subpoena. They include Epstein's calendars, emails, and other documents that have been dripping out over the past few months. Number 4, Epstein's civil case files. Dozens of civil lawsuits were filed against Epstein, Maxwell, Epstein's estate, Epstein's banks, and the FBI, mostly by victims. As these cases are litigated, a lot of discovery was produced, implicating various people and institutions in Epstein's crimes. She said 2 of the civil cases, one filed against Maxwell by victim Virginia Giuffre, and the other filed against the FBI, produced an extraordinary amount of evidence we've already seen. Plain logs, message pads, emails, etc. The Miami Herald, Brown versus Maxwell, has been responsible for the bulk of the unsealing in the Maxwell-Giuffre case, which is still ongoing. Several names in this case remain sealed, and we don't know why. They're not victims' names, but John and Jane Doe names. Wow, that's really interesting. She says, despite the release and unsealing of portions of these civil case files, many of the documents remain sealed or redacted. Media organizations such as the Miami Herald, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and some TV networks have filed requests to unseal more documents. This is a painstaking process, and it is slow. These are the documents that require a judge's ruling or a panel of judges to rule upon. She then says, the Treasury Department and IRS Epstein files. Senator Ron Wyden has been in the forefront of seeking access to Epstein's financial records. However, he has not received support from Republicans on this front. These files are important because they show how Epstein made his money. Let me pause right here for a second. Which Republicans are not supportive of this? I want to know the names of the Republicans who don't support Senator Ron Wyden's efforts. Don't you want to know how? We have to know how Jeffrey Epstein made his money. What do you mean it's Republicans standing in the way? Which Republicans are standing in the way? This seems like an absolutely pivotal piece of information that would harm no victim to know how Epstein made his money. Isn't that one of the big questions? How on earth did Epstein make his money if he went from being a high school teacher hired by former Attorney General Bill Barr's father to being like one of the richest men in the world, a financier? How exactly did he get from A to B? A core part of understanding his operation is understanding how he made money. And of course it's Republicans standing in the way. My goodness. We are going to find the names of the Republicans standing in the way, and we'll bring you that next time we talk about Epstein. It's always the Republicans. All right, Julie Brown continues and says, CIA files, if they exist. She says there has long been speculation that Epstein worked in intelligence. Release of these files, if they exist, would show to what extent he was involved in intelligence, which would perhaps also explain why he managed to get away with his crimes for so long. She said there's also the Federal Aviation Administration records. Epstein had 2 jets and flew around the world. He was, after 2008, a convicted sex offender. Did anyone ever check to see whether he was bringing in women and girls from other countries? Not all his plane logs have been made public, and while the FAA does not hold Epstein's plane logs, they do have records on where he flew. Homeland Security should also have records on his passengers when he arrived from overseas. Last I asked for them, she says, they were fully redacted. Then she says, last but not least, remember that not all the claims against Epstein and his associates were filed in court. Many of them were also settled through quiet agreements that may never be known. I know of several, she says. This is the best list I can think, summarizing the history of, quote, the Epstein files at the moment. I hope it helps clear up some misconceptions. If I forgot anything, I will file it as an added tweet. End of thread. So I found that to be extremely illustrative because when you talk about the Epstein files, you know, you picture maybe what Pam Bondi said. They're in a stack on my desk, like all in this neat little banker's box in the bowels of the Department of Justice, all neatly put together in binders. No pun intended, literal white binders. But it seems much more complex than that. It seems that the Epstein files exist in a whole host of different places, from possibly the CIA to the FBI to the Department of Justice to the FAA to all different kinds of to civil cases, to the Treasury Department, to just a whole bunch of different places have the files. And if I were Pam Bondi, maybe what I would do is I would start collecting all those files together. As the Department of Justice, if you are investigating Jeffrey Epstein, maybe you start by collecting all these records in one place so that you actually have an idea of what you're talking about. Just a suggestion. Because the Department of Justice would have the authority to do that. Probably the FBI would have the authority to do that. Kash Patel is welcome to do this as well. Get all of these files in one place so we can actually make sense of how Epstein made his money, who he was associated with, who he had on his plane with him, why some names on his travel logs were redacted, why all of these files that when media asks for them come highly blacked out. Maybe we start actually just by getting all the files in one place. And I can think of no better institution with the authority to do this than the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Department of Justice. But perhaps this suggestion is just too good of a suggestion for the FBI and the Department of Justice.